It's the winter meetings, at least as I record this, a time to dream on the unlikely and the improbable. So let's talk about a bit of antithetical history. There were two possible occasions when the Yankees and the Red Sox might have discussed a Joe DiMaggio for Ted Williams deal. It's possible that it was just one or the other, and equally possible that it was both, or none. The first occasion was just before the start of the 1946 season, when Larry MacPhail was heading up a triumvirate of owners of the Yankees.
That trio also included builder Del Webb and American Can heir Dan Topping Jr.
The three of them had taken over the team from the Jacob Ruppert estate, which had been running it
via longtime general manager and team president Ed Barrow and his magnificent eyebrows
since the beer magnate's death in 1939. MacPhail was a heavy, emphasis heavy, drinker, as was the owner of the Red Sox, Tom Yawkey, and the two of them supposedly got soused at Toots Shor's restaurant and agreed on perhaps a cocktail napkin to swap the two players. There was also a subsequent occasion 2 years later in which it was Yawkey and Topping who tried to make a deal. There are three possible reasons why, if the deals were in fact agreed upon, that they never came to fruition. Insofar as the 1946 agreement went, MacPhail believed that it was sabotaged by Ed Barrow. Apparently, out of pure spite, Barrow told Yawkey that DiMaggio was far too old and fragile. DiMaggio was going on 31 at the time, whereas Williams was only 27.
And this explanation seems at least somewhat plausible because Larry MacPhail was the kind of guy who inspired this sort of reaction in people that they might just knife him on general principles. As objective baseball advice goes, it wasn't off either. Both players had been gone for 3 years because of the war, so neither side really knew what they were going to get from either player. DiMaggio was significantly older, was fragile, and was a nervous chain smoker who suffered from ulcers.
It's also said that Yawkey simply woke up the next morning, sobered up a bit, and said, "I can't do this. This is unthinkable to trade an icon like Ted Williams," and that Topping, in a similar state, said the same thing about DiMaggio. This is a little hard to believe, at least on the Williams end, because Williams wasn't that much of an icon in Boston. He was a very controversial and often unpopular figure. DiMaggio, yes, by then was a living statue, basically. He hadn't started out that way. He wasn't that popular either prior to 1941, but after the 56-game hitting streak, that was all in the past. A third version says that Yawkey woke up, sobered up a little bit, and then came back to Topping and said, "Listen, we can still make the deal, but I think a one-for-one swap puts me at a disadvantage. Give me that left fielder you guys are grooming." That left fielder was Yogi Berra. This now would have been in the 1948-1949 offseason, and it's understandable the Yankees would be looking to shake things up because they had come in third in a very close pennant race. And it's equally obvious why Topping would have balked to throw Berra in, because at that point Berra had been in the majors for over 200 games and had hit .297 and slugged .485. The issue, which they were about to solve by firing Bucky Harris, was turning him into a full-time catcher and getting him over the defensive problems that he had early in his career. Harris wasn't committed to that. They made sure that Casey Stengel, as a condition of his hiring, would be, and they further assigned Bill Dickey to work with him and, as Berra said, learn me everything he knows. Now, earlier on, had they asked in 1946, it might have been different because MacPhail had acquired Berra sight unseen, and when Berra got back to the Yankees offices after the war, still in his navy blues, MacPhail first laid eyes on him and realized he had purchased someone who looked more like a mannequin from a display of our primitive ancestors in a natural history museum than a super prospect. He thought he had been ripped off, and he just might have given away Berra at that point. Although Branch Rickey with the Dodgers also was sniffing around Berra at that time, and MacPhail didn't bite. Probably helped that he and Rickey hated each other. Had the Red Sox actually succeeded in acquiring a long-term asset like Berra, maybe the deal would have been a good one for them, but as a straight-up swap, it would have been a net loser. The age difference was a huge deal, as were the many mounting injuries to DiMaggio. DiMaggio would be done as a great player after the 1950 season when he was 35. Williams just kept on trucking, aside from a couple of seasons lost to service in the Korean War, and was still hitting quite well when he retired under pressure from Yawkey after the 1960 season. I've always wondered how he would have done had he played one more year into the 1961 season and had gotten to participate in the kind of offensive environment that so rewarded Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. Maybe he finally would have hit the wall regardless at 42. Maybe he would have put up even more great numbers. What's always attracted people to that trade is the idea of the batters being better aligned with their stadia. Williams, a left-handed hitter, didn't get to take aim at the Green Monster in Fenway Park, and DiMaggio, a right-handed hitter, was punished by Death Valley in Yankee Stadium, and I think even a man as strong as Aaron Judge would have been challenged by needing to give the ball a 451-foot ride to the left center field fence. Let me clarify that in the interest of accuracy, and because the actual numbers are even more daunting in terms of right-handed hitters. In DiMaggio's rookie year of 1936, it was 461 to left center, and in the deepest part of the alley, it was 490. After his rookie year, they pulled in the fences a bit, all the way to 451 in left center field and to 461 in deep left center. It made quite a difference for DiMaggio, actually. His first year, he hit 8 home runs at home, 21 on the road. For the rest of his career, the park still held him back greatly, but at least he had a fighting chance. Of his remaining home runs, 140 were hit in Yankee Stadium, 192 were hit on the road. Had Williams played at Yankee Stadium, it's tempting to think that he would have spent every game blasting away at the right field porch, the same one that was built to enhance Babe Ruth's numbers, but there's no guarantee that that would have happened. First of all, he would have seen more left-handed pitching than he ever would have seen at Fenway Park, and all pitchers would have been doing everything in their power to keep him from pulling the ball, pitching him outside, and of course he was a dead pull hitter, so his whole approach might have been snarled up, whereas at Fenway Park, getting him to pull, since it was a much greater heave to right field, wasn't as bad an idea. That said, Fenway Park was a good hitter's park for everyone, left-handed and right-handed, and although Williams was denied some cheap home runs and doubles because he didn't get to pepper balls off of the Green Monster, he did demonstrably better there over the course of his career. First of all, it wasn't very far down the right field line either. He had the pesky pole to aim at. That was only about 304 during most of his career. And overall, he hit 361 at Fenway and slugged 652. At Yankee Stadium, that was 309 and 543, and no doubt some of that was due to facing better Yankees pitching, but there's really no evidence that a hitter who is already capable of hitting 400 with 40 home runs right where he was would have somehow turned into a, 450 hitter with 50 home runs in another ballpark? It's wishful thinking. Similarly, DiMaggio was not a huge fly ball hitter. Everything you read about him says that he hit crisp liners with a rising action. There are stories, hard as they are to believe, I do think they're true, that low liners that would knock a pitcher down would end up carrying out of the park. And there's something to be said for the fact that Yankee Stadium, which did frustrate the hell out of him, made him a more disciplined all-around hitter because the pure pull approach just would not have worked. He did slug 605 at Fenway Park versus 547 at Yankee Stadium, and again, that's because Fenway was just all around a better hitter's park than Yankee Stadium was. But then we get back to the question of age, and the fact that the Red Sox would have been able to enjoy his company for only a few years. I also wonder if Williams would have been even more ill-suited from a personality standpoint to deal with the New York media and New York fans than he was to deal with the Boston media and the Boston fans. Boston was a highly literate town. It had a ton of newspapers for a city its size, and they had intense circulation wars, and sometimes it seems as if their strategy for coming out on top was to see which could offer the better assassination pieces on Williams. New York was even larger and had even more papers, and thus the outrage when Williams did something like flip off the fans for booing him or spit in the general direction of the seats, if a little more restrained, more professional, less vitriolic, would still have been pretty big and pretty loud. In any case, even if the discussions were true, he didn't want to go there. At the time, ball players served completely at the whim of their owners, which is why Yawkey and Topping or Yawkey and MacPhail could talk about swapping these iconic players regardless of how they felt about it. They were more like a stable of racehorses than people or even employees that had to be respected. None of the aforementioned trio of owners ever clarified this business, but according to Lee Montville's book on Williams, he was asked for a reaction to the rumors. And he said, "I'd hate to be traded to the Yankees. I don't like New York. I just don't want to play there. I wish I had a clause in my contract saying that I couldn't be traded to a club without my consent." Now, what he was wishing for in that last bit was what Marvin Miller and various subsequent player association heads and the players themselves later achieved through bargaining. But the first part, the "I don't want to go to New York no matter what" part, and I wish there was a clause in my contract saying I couldn't go to New York, I wonder how that would play today on social media. It certainly wouldn't have played well in the papers back then, but social media is so much faster and bigger. And I think because of the way that something like Twitter squares and cubes emotions with people reacting very quickly and trying to top each other, just like the Boston papers tried to top each other by piling on the negativity and coming up with the better put down, Williams today would have been metaphorically tarred and feathered. Some of those people really do want you to kill yourself. And I just wish that fans and writers, mostly fans though, take into account that when a Giancarlo Stanton says, "No, I'd rather not play in San Francisco or St. Louis," or when a Shohei Otani says, "I'm not interested in taking all the money in the world from the Yankees, I want to play where I want to play," or he says, "Even though Seattle is sort of in the vicinity of where I want to play, I'm not particularly interested in going to that town or that team for whatever reason," that they would accept it with a little more grace and equanimity and friendliness than they typically do. Because here's the thing, not everybody has to love the thing that you love. And by becoming a fan, this is not true of every fan, but of many, you've already surrendered your perspective. They haven't. They get to care about what they care about for their reasons, their priorities. And those are not necessarily about disdaining you or the thing that you care about or the place that you live. It's just, look, it's not what they want to do. And if we could take that knowledge, that understanding, and export it not just from baseball, but to every area of our lives where we disagree, we'd be much better off. It is incumbent upon us to understand that at all times. And if we did, we'd be much better off. We could all get along better. We call it empathy, and it's in very short supply. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is the Infinite Inning Baseball Podcast. It's the third night on the drive from Abilene, and the cattle have bedded down for the night, and so have you. You're about to drift off when you hear what seems like the sound of thunder. It had been a clear, calm night, and you pay it no mind, but when the ground begins to shake, you emerge from the tent to see the cattle stampeding. But what could have set them off? You look to the top of the high mesa that dominates the scene, and there, caught in the moonlight, there's an odd figure with horns of a steer, feathers, and flaming red chaps. He makes eye contact with you, and it's if an ice pick has gone through your soul. You suddenly understand how the cows feel, and like those little dogies, you turn and run. And it's not them that you hear mooing and bleating in mortal fear. It's you, a thought you only have moments to consider before you follow them off the edge of your own mesa into oblivion. And on the long way down, you realize you shouldn't have driven those dogies to Abilene, but to episode 33. Fair prices, highest quality beef only. Welcome back to the show. Cliff Corcoran returns this week, and we have an episode that is almost relentlessly focused on baseball, given that the winter meetings just happened and there was finally, for the first time since October, a lot to talk about. I feel like I say this every week, but we really luxuriated in the sheer amount of baseball stuff that we had to talk about, so I'm going to keep this section compensatingly brief. I'm probably lying. It seems like I'm always lying. I have good intentions, but in this instance, I never do manage to do that. And what I have for you is, I hope, kind of a treat that I think only I, in this instance, can provide. What it is that at this time of year, when the winter meetings happen, we always pray for an active winter meetings. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Mostly, it feels like it doesn't, particularly in the era of free agency, when the winter meetings became secondary to waiting for the big names to sign. Now that fewer big names actually reach the market, there's a little bit more trading. It seems like there was less of that this year. It would be unfair to expect the kind of trade that the Yankees and the Orioles made on November 17th, 1954, because there's never been another trade like it. It's the most highly populated trade ever. 17 players changed hands, and there were rumors of an 18th who never materialized. The Orioles acquired 10 players from the Yankees: veteran outfielder Gene Woodling, right-handed pitcher Harry Bird, right-handed pitcher Jim McDonald, infielder Willie Miranda, catcher Hal Smith, catcher first baseman Gus Triandos, and 4 players to be named later: left-handed pitcher Bill Miller, third baseman Cal Segrist, second baseman Don Leppert. Leppert always sounds like a Dr. Seuss character to me somehow. And outfielder Theodore Del Guercio, the last of whom never made the majors. Everybody else did. The Yankees received 7 players: right-handed pitcher Bob Turley, right-handed pitcher Don Larson, shortstop Billy Hunter, and 4 players to be named later. They were right-handed pitcher Mike Blizka, catcher Darrell Johnson, outfielder Jim Fridley, and first baseman Dick Kryhoski, who had been with the Yankees previously. All those players to be named later were in the deal because the Rule 5 draft was upcoming and the teams wanted to keep their rosters free so that they didn't lose any of their acquisitions right after they got them. As it turned out, none of them really had any impact whatsoever for anybody, and the deal, in a big way, in terms of lasting value, came down to the Yankees getting Turley and Larson for Woodling, who was 32 but had many, many years of productive play left, even if the Orioles flipped him out of town fairly quickly, and Triandos, who was kind of an Evan Gattis type. The Yankees and the minors had moved him back and forth between catcher and first base. A scouting report at the time of the deal said that his best position was hitter. He wasn't great defensively, but he did pop quite a few home runs for the day. Everything else was kind of a loss. The whole idea was kind of a loss. And the trade was spectacularly unpopular in Baltimore. The Orioles had just finished their first year in Baltimore after failing out of St. Louis, and they had lost 100 games, and they had given over control of the team to Paul Richards, who was going to be manager and general manager. Richards is a weird guy in that he has a great reputation as a manager and executive without actually ever winning anything. This is with the White Sox as a manager, with the Orioles as the manager and GM, and with the Astros as the GM. He was a better builder and generally left behind organizations that were far stronger than when he got them, but never did get to the promised land himself. Anyway, Richard's idea was that the team that had come over from St. Louis was moribund, and this is an idea that you see even today, that you can jumpstart the farm team and rebuild everything much faster if you trade some of the few parts that you have for a lot of parts that somebody else has. The problem was, in this instance, that Turley was only 23. He was known as the new Bob Feller, basically, and whereas that wasn't deserved, he was a very good pitcher. He had just led the American League in strikeouts with 185. He had also just led the league in walks with 181. This is in 247.1 innings. And he was popular because he was basically the only kind of watchable thing they had. And whereas Baltimore was thrilled to have a major league team, they were also disappointed that all they had gotten was the Browns in ornithological drag. But they gravitated to Turley as kind of a consolation prize. They also liked the shortstop, Hunter, who the Yankees were planning on using to replace Phil Rizzuto. The problem was he couldn't hit even slightly. Nor, in fact, could the utility infielder the Orioles got to replace him in the deal, Willie Miranda, whose OPS plus for his career was about 50. But Hunter was a flashy fielder, and you know how people disproportionately prize them. Larson, he was like 3-21 in his career at that point, and whereas everybody thought he had great ability, it hadn't translated itself in the same way that Turley's had. As I think you know, the problem with trading a star, and we can call Turley a star, he certainly wasn't a finished product, but he was an all-star that year, and he later would win the Cy Young Award in 1958 with a league-leading 21 wins. The problem is that prospects, even if you get top prospects, the odds are that most of them are not going to develop into a player comparable to the established player that you're getting rid of, and that's what happened here. And in this instance, it's not just that the theory was wrong, but that Paul Richards did a poor job of picking players from the Yankees system. He got a whole bunch of junk that they didn't want, and they got to keep their best prospects. If he had made the kind of deal that, say, Brian Cashman did when he got rid of Aroldis Chapman and brought back Gleyber Torres and other players, and it still didn't work out, well, that's one thing. But in this case, he just took his best pitchers and traded them for junk. The Yankees had come in second. They had won 100 games, but they had come in second to this historic Indians team anyway, and they decided that what they needed was pitching and that Turley and Larson were the way that they were going to get it. Actually, and this is more insulting to Richards, Turley and Larson weren't their first choices. They were hoping to get the lefty Billy Pierce and shortstop Chico Carrasquel from the White Sox, but they couldn't come to an agreement, so they settled for ripping off Richards instead. Richards would have preferred to just trade Larson, but understandably, everybody that he talked to just wanted Turley, so he gave him up. And as unpopular as the deal was, and there were a lot of jokes about how he couldn't go home, he said, "We're not going to do it with one player. The past 2 years, this club lost 200 ball games with Turley and Larson. With all due respect to Turley, the best thing we could do was win more games rather than glorify one man. He may win 40 games for the Yankees, but not for us, with the club that we had." Many episodes back when I suggested to Jesse Spector that the Mets trade Yoenis Cespedes, something I brought up to Cliff today too, because it was one of the smarter moves they could make to trade an expensive, fragile player to restock their team, Jesse said, there are only so many times you can kick a fan base in the crotch, and this was that kind of move. There were several man-on-the-street reaction-type pieces in the papers the next day. The comments are extraordinary. Someone had a real brainstorm. You get that one good player and then let him go. For Mantle and Berra, maybe, but I still think they should retain Turley and build around him. "I'm afraid my 2 kids will lynch Richards. They're practically in tears," said Mrs. George Davis. "Turley has shown so much promise." In another, a father said he was sitting at home when he heard his boy give out a strangled cry, and he went running into the room thinking that his best friend had died. But no, the lad had just heard that Richards had traded Turley. Parenthetically, by the way, that quote is from the Baltimore Sun and other places. In writing up the trade, the Baltimore Sun, in a way that would, let's just say, not be PC today, wondered if they would also deal off catcher Clint Courtney, quote, "Baltimore's lone remaining chattel, strongly attractive on baseball's slave market." I don't think a writer today would get away with comparing baseball players to slaves and trades to the auction block. Ick. Bullet Bob wasn't effective for that long. All those walks and strikeouts and high innings totals burned his arm out pretty quickly, but he was a good acquisition for the Yankees. And he's been dead for about 4 years now. But here's kind of the cool thing. I got to talk to him back in 2007, and I never did do anything with the audio. I thought it would be neat, since this huge trade is still something that we can all wish for to repeat itself in some form, and that Bob is no longer around to speak for himself, that I might play you my brief conversation with him. Now, what was on my mind that day was not this deal, I regret to say, although, as you'll hear, I did tee him up to talk about it a little. But a memorable appearance that he had. His trade mate, Larson, of course, pitched probably the most famous game in World Series history, the perfect game against the Dodgers in 1956. That was Game 5. The next day, Turley had a game that in its way was at least as fascinating. He and Dodgers pitcher Clem Labine got together at Ebbets Field and threw zeros at each other for 9.5 innings. Turley was, in a weird sort of way, dominant. Going into the 10th inning, he had allowed only 3 hits, but he had walked 8 and struck out 11. As you hear me say to him, I don't know what his pitch count was, but it must have been insanely high. He retired the first batter, pitcher Clem Labine, in the bottom of the 10th, and you'll note that neither manager made the slightest move towards the bullpen in this whole game. He walked Jim Gilliam for his 8th walk of the game. Pee Wee Reese bunted Gilliam over to second. Casey Stengel called for an intentional walk of Duke Snyder. That put runners on first and second for Turley to face Jackie Robinson. Robinson singled to left field, was enough to score Gilliam from second. Game over, and the Dodgers had forced a decisive Game 7, which they would lose at home the next day, 9-0. A bit of an anticlimax after the Larson and Turley games back-to-back, but whichever side you were on, that must have been among the most stressful 2 days in baseball history. Here's Turley talking about it. I should warn you that this audio was recorded in a full stadium. There's a lot of background noise. It was really just for my own purposes to possibly be transcribed for an article. I tried to do some noise reduction on it. It doesn't really help, so I'm just going to give it to you as it was, and I hope you can make it all out and that it's enjoyable to you. Here's my conversation with the late Bob Turley.
I was curious about the Game 6, or in 56, the heartbreaker you lost in 10.
It was against Brooklyn, the 6th game of the series. Yeah.
Right. You were in there for 10 innings. I think you walked 8 and struck out a whole bunch of guys.
Yeah, I struck out. I set a Yankee strikeout record for World Series in that game.
Right.
I give up, I want to say 3 hits, but probably in my memories it might be 4, but 3 hits I remember real well. I'm just explaining those that one got lost in the sun and to the left fielder didn't catch it. And one got down a foul line and the left fielder ran over, hit the wall, and the ball fell in territory right behind him. And the last one was in the 10th inning. Jackie Robinson hit a ball right at him. He just had to catch the ball, but he ran in, charged the ball, and knew he made a mistake. He never could recover it. I got beat 1-0.
Today, everybody kind of panics if a pitcher throws 110 pitches. Oh, yeah. You must have thrown 200 pitches in that game.
Easy. A lot of time I was around. A winning game for me was around 135 to 150 pitches. But I pitched 22 innings in a ball game. I pitched 16 innings in a ball game. But I never had a sore arm my whole career, and the reason for that is my arm was in shape. Right. You know, you can get your legs in shape, you can get your body in shape. There's only one way to get your arms in shape. You got to throw a lot. You got to throw a lot in spring training. You got to pitch, and you got to do all those things.
Did Casey talk to you about coming out of that game?
No. I don't think he came to the mound one time. He did say one thing was at a World Series victory party. So Johnny Cuts pitched, and next year I got 1-9-0. He came to me, he says, I never felt so sorry for a person you, but I want to tell you something. You pitched the best game that was pitched in this World Series.
Well, that's saying
something.
And
he meant that saying because Larson pitched the perfect game the day before.
Well, I was going to say that, everybody remembers it for Larson's perfect game, but you had this really heroic performance the next day. Yeah. And then Cuts, who, didn't have a great career. He had just that 1 year, really, that was very good, but pitched a shutout in the 7th game.
The 3 of us went 9 innings and give up 1 run in 3 games.
That's amazing. How was your relationship with Casey?
Well, it was always pretty good. We had our differences from time to time. He liked ball players that would be a little fight back for what they believe in, and he was a good manager. But New York's always had good teams, and so he can't make a lot of mistakes if you're pitting in a guy that's better than a guy that's coming out. But he was a good manager. He really was. It kept you on your toes, laughing all the time.
I've talked to a lot of guys who played for him, and they taught you see 2 sides to him in a way. Sometimes he can be very sarcastic, very harsh, but then they also talk about him being kind of privately generous also.
Yeah, well, the problem with Casey was that he talked more to the press than he talked to us.
Right.
And you would read what you did wrong in the paper next day. And that was his style of management, which a lot of players didn't like, because they'd rather have a manager tell them what you're doing wrong and don't want to get that out of the clubhouse. But he had a different habit of doing that.
Did you play for Paul Richards?
No, Paul Richards did the nicest thing for me he ever done in his life.
Right.
At the end of the 1954 season, he took over Baltimore Orioles, general manager and the manager.
Right.
I was going to pitch the last day of the season, and I had won 14 games and lost 15. And he asked me to come in, and he said, Bob, you don't have to pitch, but if you want to pitch, you can pitch. but he said, you're going to be here a long time. He said, we're going to build this club around you. 2 weeks later, he traded me to the New York Yankees, and God bless him.
With about 20 other guys.
Yeah, 19 players, 18 or 19 players altogether.
Right. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
You think. So,
our conversation went on from there. I asked him to reminisce a bit about Billy Martin, but I'll save that for another day when it's more appropriate. And in the meantime, I'll be waiting for Derek Jeter to package 7 to 10 Marlins at a time and send them to some other, more professional ball club. We'll take a quick break for a word from our sponsors, and I'll be back with Cliff Corcoran in just a moment. If the Phillies had a distinct cap for their Blue Jays period during World War II, I assume Cliff Corcoran would own one. I don't know that they did. There's certainly no cutesy bird logo for the Phillies, which is too bad, really. It was a missed opportunity. Nonetheless, we welcome him back here in his regular slot in the show to talk about the ongoing winter meetings. He's at Sports on Earth when you want to read him. How are you, Cliff?
Doing well, Steve. How's it going?
Well, I'm not sure, really. I've got a list here in front of me of the transactions that have come out in or around the winter meetings to this stage. And we have the Stanton thing, the Giancarlo Stanton thing, obviously, and the Yankees dumping Chase Headley back to the Padres, and a whole slew of relievers signing with different teams. And I was just looking at a Ken Rosenthal tweet that talked about how the Rockies are building a power bullpen, which excites me not at all because as far as I know right now, Gerardo Parra is still slotted in as the regular right fielder. And honestly, outside of Nolan Arenado, there's not a whole lot in their offense to be excited by. So what profit a man if he gaineth an entire bullpen but loseth his offense? So far, and as we're talking, it's Wednesday, there's one day to go, and that day is usually kind of anticlimactic. It's the Rule 5 draft, and everybody gets out of Dodge. I feel a little let down. A lot of rumors, but no actual action, or very little actual action. How about you?
Yeah, no, same thing. The relievers are coming off the board pretty quickly. Jake McGee's gone back to the Rockies, who also added Brian Shaw. We've seen Brandon Morrow go to the Cubs, Pat Neshek go to the Phillies. The Phillies, interestingly enough, are making some moves on relievers, signing Neshek and Hunter, Tommy Hunter, which, Tommy Hunter is one of these guys who I've never really believed in as a starter or a reliever. He's coming off a good year, and I'm fairly certain he's going to regress. So I don't know.
Wait, what does that leave? You don't believe in him as a starter or a reliever. So you're just like John Lennon. I don't believe in Tommy Hunter. I just believe in me, Yoko, and me.
Pretty much.
And that's reality.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe in Pat Neshek, though. Does that matter? He's one of these guys who throws really hard and gives up although I guess the past couple of years he's gotten his home run totals down, but 2 years ago he wasn't very good. He's kind of injured. He moves all around. I don't feel like he's a high end relief arm. He's one of these guys who's always working in relief for somebody, and kind of like your standard backup catcher, every 4 or 5 years they're going to have a spike of some kind. And I feel like Hunter had that last year, and then this year it's not going to work out so well. But it's still interesting to see the Phillies be aggressive for relief pitching, because when you go through their lineup, you see things really are kind of starting to come together for them, at least on that side of the ball. Nick Williams had a good rookie season. Rice Hoskins, obviously, is it Reese Hoskins or Rice Hoskins? Had that tremendous, 2 months that proved at the very least that he can hit major league pitching. We don't know what level of production to expect from him going forward, but the power is real, translates at the major league level. Cesar Hernandez has been good for a couple of years. Looks like Jorge Alfaro is ready to take over behind the plate full time. If Odubel Herrera isn't necessarily the guy he was a couple of years ago, he's still a valuable piece in center. Aaron Althor, there are guys up and down that lineup where you say, okay, these are guys in their early to mid 20s, and they're all there now. Maybe JP Crawford hasn't necessarily taken over at shortstop yet and was a little disappointing in his first major league look, but it's all kind of coming together a little bit on that side of the ball. You notice, though, I ignored Michael Franco, but at the same time, if the other guys come together, then maybe you can figure something out about third base. But on the other side of the ball, not so much. Aaron Nola is very good, but Vince Velasquez has been hurt and didn't pitch very well last year at all when he was healthy. The other guys are just kind of, there's nobody really excites you. Jake Thompson didn't really come through as a prospect the way you expect, although certainly the jury's not out yet on him. It makes sense to strengthen your bullpen when you're not optimistic about your rotation. That's a strategy that we've seen other teams take in recent years and has paid off for some of them. But it's interesting to see the Phillies in their situation where the Nationals are going to be a dominant team in that division, and there's some very good teams throughout the league. You don't necessarily know if the Phillies are ready to make a move, but they're being kind of aggressive here on relief pitching in the hope that maybe things will break right for them this year. Shows you some optimism there that wasn't there a year ago.
I don't know if it's just because I'm still in that John Lennon mindset, or it rhymes, or both, that I want to ask if you believe in Neshek, do you believe in Swarzak? That's the other big pitch. I say big in scare quotes, big pitching move. He went to the Mets. And here's the thing, no disrespect to Swarzak, who turned his career around nicely last year after kind of basically being last man on the roster material for a season or two. I just, with a lot of these relievers, I feel like they slot in almost interchangeably, in the same way that Casey Stengel said you have to have a catcher or else you'll have a lot of passed balls. You have to have relievers because somebody has to come into the game after the starter. With some of these guys who are not reliable year in, year out relievers, and that's actually a very narrow category, would have included Luke Gregerson until this year. And he just signed with the Cardinals, who, if I recall, were his original organization. Again, it seems like a lot of activity without necessarily a lot of substance.
That's kind of the attitude I have about like an Anthony Suarez. I feel that way about Brian Shaw, honestly. Brian Shaw's been considered one of those key pieces in that Indians bullpen for the last couple of years. Brian Shaw doesn't impress me terribly much. He's done pretty well. 3.5, 3.25 ERA the last couple of years. His strikeouts came down a little bit. He's thrown a ton of games, 75 2 years ago, 79 last year. But the overall performance behind that, you look at things like deserved run average or FIP, and they don't really suggest that he's pitching at an elite level. And now he's signed with the Rockies, and I don't feel good about that. Swarzak I actually do believe in. 2 years ago, he had a 5.52 ERA, but he had outstanding peripherals. The DRA liked him. He's had a good strikeout to walk ratio for a while now. I feel like that's a good deal, but then he's going to the Mets, and the Mets are cursed. So,
Well, cursed or incompetent, sometimes it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends.
Very true.
Of these sort of, I don't want to insult anybody by calling them fringy, but hell, let's. Like these fringy moves, one that excites me, kind of, in a disproportionate way, is that the Cubs signed Tyler Chatwood away from the Rockies. And it's not like Tyler Chatwood is an ace relative to the league. He doesn't strike anybody out, although his strikeouts were up relative to his career performance this year, probably because everybody's were. But he's just a ground ball machine. He's not always healthy. He's not always effective, but he goes through stretches of being really good. And it seems like a pitcher of that nature plays to the Cubs' strengths, namely Addison Russell and Javier Baez.
Well, I think that's exactly what the Cubs were thinking. Chatwood, again, is not a guy that impresses me very much. He's got very high walk rates. He came up as an Angels prospect, was traded to the Rockies, had 1 year where he got to 20 starts and had a pretty good ERA, very good for being in Colorado. Then he had the Tommy John surgery. Since he's come back from that, he's had trouble keeping his walks down. He walked 4 per 9 innings 2 years ago. This past season, 4.7. He doesn't have the strikeout rate. Nobody can counteract a 4.7 walks per 9 innings, really. But even him, he doesn't have the strikeout rates that would suggest, well, he's striking everybody out. He's going to walk some, but he's going to strand those guys. Not true. We're talking about a strikeout to walk ratio around 1.5, which is terrible. But like you say, the ground balls, and he had Arenado and LeMahieu behind him in Colorado, and the Cubs are probably thinking, well, we've got an outstanding infield defense. We can take him out of Colorado and keep outstanding defense behind him, and he can be a good maybe fourth or fifth starter for us. And yeah, maybe, but also he's a guy who's never thrown 160 innings in a season. He's never made more than 27 starts. This past year, he was bumped to the bullpen towards the end of the year. I don't feel great about Tyler Chatwood either. I mean, as a fifth starter on an otherwise good team, yeah, I guess so. It'll be interesting to see with the Cubs whether or not they use Mike Montgomery, stretch him back out as a starter, and think about possibly using the starter again. Last year, he basically failed the audition. It was very bad when he was starting, pitched well when he was put back in the bullpen. but not a great year for him overall. He had 7 starts 2 years ago, 14 this past year. And so as a result, he's not really stretched out. Neither one of those guys is going to give you 180 innings out of a rotation spot. So there's not a lot of, I feel like that the Cubs could use at least one more starter, despite the fact that they just gave Tyler Chatwood, and they gave him like $38 million or something like that. They gave him a decent contract. So yeah, I see what they're thinking. I also saw what the Royals were thinking about Ian Kennedy, which was, here's a guy who has good peripherals, but he gives up a ton of home runs. Well, we'll put him in the ballpark. That's one of the hardest places in the majors to hit the home runs, but it didn't really work out too well either. So, sometimes I think teams can overthink it a little bit, and certainly around the margins, you're not going to get many rotation guys for $38 million, I guess, at this point in things. But I'm not terribly optimistic, but I guess I shouldn't be, because again, we're talking about a back end guy. What we've seen so far moving in terms of the pitchers who have signed has not been the high end of either the starter or reliever market. We've seen Miles Mikolas come back from Japan. We've seen 2 Tommy John surgery recipients sign deals that they're probably not going to pitch until 2019, and Michael Pineda and Drew Smiley. We've seen Doug Fister get a $4 million deal. Mike Minor maybe get moved back into the rotation. We just talked about Chatwood. And then, when it comes to the high end of the relief market, there's still Greg Holland and Wade Davis and Fernando Rodney, who are the guys, the quote unquote established closers. Addison Reed is still out there. Those are kind of the very top of the top guys, although there is a rumor out now that the Rockies are trying to bring Holland back, just adding more arms, which again is a similar strategy to what the Phillies were doing. But so while we have seen a lot of movement in the pitching market, we haven't seen one of the big dominoes fall yet. And then on the other side of the ball, we haven't seen much. We've seen 2 of the top 3 catchers sign, but really the other positions are all no movement yet at all, beyond trades. And to that end, there's a report, as we're recording this Wednesday afternoon about 1:30, and it's just come across my Twitter and everybody else's, of course, that the Cardinals just struck a deal. We don't know what they're sending back to the Marlins, but they're bringing in Marcell Ozuna. So the Marlins teardown continues apace.
Holy priceless collection of Dominican snoods, Batman. That is a heck of a deal. Well, we don't know. It's hard for me to say what kind of deal it is because, as you said, we don't know the full ramifications. But heading into today, the Cardinals outfield was some combination of Tommy Pham, Dexter Fowler, Stephen Piscotty, once again Randall Grichuk, who is the meal that keeps recurring. It's definitely an upgrade. I don't know if it wholly heals a Cardinal offense that was very patchy last year. They still don't have, for example, a regular first baseman, assuming Matt Carpenter's over at third. But it certainly seems like a step in the right direction, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. They needed a big bat, and Marcell Ozuna's coming off a tremendous season where he had 37 home runs, hit .312 with the .376 on base, slugged .548. And he's going into his age 27 season. He has 2 years of team control left, so he's still in arbitration. It's not a big contract. It's not necessarily a big commitment, but it's a guy who has always been considered very talented, has shown flashes coming off a big year. Now, are they buying high? Again, we don't know what the return is yet, so it's hard to judge that. And at the same time, he's not a big commitment guy. He's, like I said, an year-to-year arbitration player, so not necessarily huge savings for the Marlins, but this just shows the degree to which they're slashing and that they're getting rid of a player who has no real commitment beyond the fact that he's going to make $8 million salary in the coming season via arbitration. But he's now the hitter that their order is built around, along with maybe Tommy Pham. And Tommy Pham's going into his age 29 season. I don't know how much he's going to repeat the season he just had, but he was outstanding. So you've got those 2 guys we assume maybe in the corners around Dexter Fowler. Again, we don't know if Grichuk or somebody else is going back to the Marlins. We're not really sure. From what I'm seeing in terms of what was rumored, and again, by the time somebody listens to this, they'll know all these answers, but is that the Marlins were looking for an outfielder back because they just traded two of them and a starting pitching prospect or something in that neighborhood. So it's very likely with the Cardinals now having just this glut of outfielders, because also, Jose Martinez had a very good rookie. Again, he's going into his age 29 season, but was another kind of breakout rookie player for them last year. I heard that they might be interested in using him at first base quite a bit in the coming season. But so yeah, between Ozuna, Fowler, Pham, Piscotty, Grichuk, Martinez, they've got way too many guys who can play the outfield. You got to assume one of them most likely is going back to the Marlins. But they needed a bat that got a bat. It's hard to argue with that acquisition until we see what they had to send back.
The thing I kind of loved about what the Cardinals had this last year in Tommy Pham, who, as you pointed out, was a 29-year-old rookie, and Jose Martinez, who is a 29-year-old rookie, is that it was really a throwback in a sense to the 1920s and 30s, where if you look at these players, there were always guys who would come up and have these very short careers because the minors were so much more vast and scouting was so much more primitive, and you could just miss a guy, or he'd be in the Pacific Coast League where the salaries were actually better in some instances than they were in the major leagues, and they just didn't want to leave. It didn't have the same prestige to go up, or if it did, dollars spoke louder. And so from time to time, a team might say, like, well, we'll try Ike Boone, or we'll try Buzz Arlett or somebody, even though they're 28 or 29 or 30. So you'd have these great rookie seasons, and then they'd go back down where they could make more money, or it turned out they were in the minors as veteran players for a reason. And the Cardinals, and this is a weird thing for the Cardinals to be plugging these guys in. It made me nostalgic for something probably that nobody else cares about or was aware of. But really, they had nothing to center that team around. And guys like Dexter Fowler are really good complementary players, but aren't necessarily the guy you want to see, or the quality of player that if he's batting third or fourth, or if your cleanup hitter is no better than Dexter Fowler, you're going to contend. And I think Ozuna is possibly that guy. And the other cool thing is, although he's probably a little stretched in center, he's a good enough defensive outfielder that if they feel like that's where he has to go, I don't think it'll kill them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, he's a talented young player coming off a great season. So it's hard to argue with that acquisition. And they needed some help on the offense. As far as you say the Pacific Coast League guys, some of them just were from the West Coast and didn't want to leave. They've got family things that if you could play baseball at home and make roughly the same salary it was almost like it was an entire different country on some level. They had their own major league. But a guy like Pham is somebody who, injuries have kind of cut short some of his opportunities. And because of this cluster of players they've had, I mentioned the number of players they have with Ozuna, but even before Ozuna and Fowler, with Pham and Piscotty and Grichuk, and they had Matt Holliday up until 2016 taking up a spot, there wasn't room for all of the outfield prospects they had to get full-time looks. And, they'd have one guy would have a hot stretch and somebody else would get hurt and they get pushed back down. But so now you've got Piscotty, who's going into his age 27 season, coming off a down year. He may be pushed out of the picture now. Grichuk is just going to be 26 this coming season, but he's always kind of been a power-only type of player, and so he may get pushed out. Pham obviously took a big advantage of an opportunity last year, but if he starts to fade back, then whichever one of those other guys is still on the roster once we find out how the Cardinals finish up their offseason, I could very easily see them switching out a Piscotty or a Grichuk for Tommy Pham.
They still have that flexibility. The downside of that is, and I think you were alluding to this, they also don't have to make a commitment to anybody, and you're constantly trying to capture the hot hand, which sometimes, to their credit, they did with a guy like Grichuk, who has all that power. And when he's not swinging at every ball in the universe, he will connect and hit some balls over the fences. But the rest of the time, obviously, he's kind of a loss due to his total lack of on-base percentage. And so it would help if they had some options that they like better. And of course, that was exacerbated by, I think, Piscotty in particular, who seemed like he was going to be a mainstay of that lineup for a long time and just really seem to regress badly this year. But before we go any further into the Cardinals, who, they're the Cardinals, I think they're going to be all right. They are one of the most consistently well-run organizations in baseball, however odd this transitory period that they're in has been. I do want to talk about what's happening with the Marlins and with Stanton and Ozuna and whether Christian Yelich is going to be back and dealing away D. Gordon and just sort of your take on the Derek Jeter administration thus far.
My primary takeaway is that it's a shame. The Marlins had the 5th best offense in the National League last year. They scored more runs than the Dodgers.
And like zero pitching.
Yeah, and zero pitching, right. And obviously one of the reasons for that was Jose Fernandez's death, which robbed them of a 1A ace, league-wide ace. They had the offense, and they just needed to do something about their pitching. Now, admittedly, they needed to do a lot with their pitching. Last year, they thought that maybe, as we just talked about with the Phillies and maybe the Rockies, they thought, well, our rotation has this huge hole blown in it. Maybe we can strengthen the bullpen and things can work out. And that didn't really work out for a variety of reasons, but the bullpen just never really coalesced last year, despite the quality of the arms they had in it, and the rotation was terrible. But in guys that they thought were going to be good, Adam Conley had a horrible year. Wei-Yin Chin just can't stay healthy. You go up and down the line. At the same time, they had really a playoff quality offense, and so the idea was that with new ownership, maybe they could do something about their pitching. This is a good pitching market this offseason. Maybe they could add what they need to be challenging for a wild card in the coming year. That is what you would hope would happen with the team being bought with new ownership. Instead, what happened is that it very well may be that the Miami Marlins are just not an attractive team for anybody to buy, but the team wound up getting sold to an ownership group that could barely afford to buy the team, let alone run it. And almost immediately after they purchased the team, heavily leveraged, they started sending out requests to try to get additional cash infusion, additional investors. One report I saw, I believe from John Heyman, said they were looking for something in the area of $300 million worth of cash infusion via additional investors, which interestingly enough happens to be roughly how much was left on Giancarlo Stanton's contract. So obviously the Stanton contract gets dealt to get them some of that money, but they still don't have what they need financially. And now it's clearly that it's not just they need that $300 million, but they are tearing down the entire team. D. Gordon going out, and D. Gordon's not a Giancarlo Stanton type player, but he's valuable for them. And now with Marcell Ozuna, like I said, a guy who's in arbitration years, who has no large commitment beyond the 8-figure salary he's making in the coming year. It's just a complete teardown. And so maybe that's what they needed to do. I mean, you could make the argument that, they had this great offense, but for the most part, they were talking about players who were getting into their late 20s, so it was a kind of a win-now situation, and if they couldn't build that pitching staff up in a year or two, then they were going to have to tear it down eventually anyway. But it's really just brutal for the fans, for the team, for baseball in a way, to have a team purchased by new ownership and then immediately just tear down what was half of a very good team.
Hold that thought, Cliff. We interrupt your filibuster for a word from our sponsors. Full senatorial privileges will be restored after this break.
It's painful to watch. And on top of all of that, whether it's Jeter or whether it's Sherman, a bunch of bad look decisions have been made on top of that. Firing broadcasters, firing the scout while he's in the hospital recovering from cancer surgery. A lot of this gets put on Jeter. I don't know if necessarily he was the guy making all of those decisions, but he's kind of the face of the organization now. So he's going to kind of have to own those decisions getting made. He is the CEO. He is the head of baseball operations. The buck seems to stop with him to some degree, even though he is not the principal owner. Bruce Sherman is. And it just on down the line, and then trading Stanton, and then that night, instead of being at the winter meetings or even just available in Miami for a press conference, Jeter shows up at the Dolphins game, having fun with his, swimsuit model wife. It's just not a good look. It's almost as if A-Rod and Derek Jeter have switched bodies, in that sense of not just sticking whatever the public relations version of sticking your foot in your mouth is, just constantly making the worst possible decision in terms of how things look. Because that was, A-Rod's problem for a long time wasn't necessarily that he was, obviously all the performing enhancing drug stuff was horrible. Beyond that, a lot of the things he was criticized for were just stupid things that, like, just, dude, think about it for a moment. Maybe, whatever it is, the sunbathing in Central Park or the Cameron Diaz popcorn stuff, people jumped on him for those. They're silly things that nobody should have picked on. But it was just, he was always so awkward and doing the wrong thing that every time he did something slightly weird, people jumped all over it. Well, now that's Derek Jeter as the head of baseball operations for the Marlins. And it's in combination with tearing down the team, which is the one legitimate, real bad thing that's happening. It's just kind of a disaster down there. It's kind of stunning that, we got rid of Jeffrey Loria, and what's come in has not been an improvement so far.
What I'm fascinated by, or am condemnatory of, is not necessarily the Stanton trade, because the Stanton contract is a very bad contract. I think everybody agrees. It's not necessarily that on a season-by-season basis he's overpriced given his production, but that it rises to $25 million in the coming season. It rises all the way up to $32 million by the time he's 33. And he's signed at prices from there ranging back to $25 million through age 38. And then there's an option for age 39, which is going to cost $10 million to buy out versus paying $25 million in total. And there's reason to believe maybe that he'll live up to that. There's also reason to believe that, and by live up to that, I mean just be a viable major league player throughout that period. But he does also get hurt. He may not be this level player all the way through. In fact, it's likely not. And the Yankees may have a repeat of the A-Rod situation on their hands. And I don't, again, as you clarified, I don't mean the PED stuff, but the fact that they just have this dead weight on their roster, which is taking up a significant amount of payroll for no return. And then they had the awkward situation of trying to catch A-Rod into retiring, which is what ultimately happened. Like, do you quit or do we embarrass you by releasing you or what? What bothers me overall is that during those discussions that you alluded to, when they were trying to recruit additional investment, allegedly what they were bandying about was an overall payroll figure of about $55 million. Now, this year they were, by the figures at Baseball Reference, at about $112 million. Overall, Major League payrolls ranged from $207 million all the way down to $49 million. But only two teams were below or even close to that $55 million figure. The A's were at about $52 million. They're looking for a new ballpark and are not going to spend until they get that situation resolved. So they're in a special category. The Padres, who were theoretically tanking, although they didn't do a great job of it, ironically, were at $49 million. Everybody else was $68 million and up. What bothers me is that Major League Baseball, one, would approve an ownership that right from the outset had no intention of sustaining a payroll in even range of the median or average Major League payroll area, because you're not going to be competitive otherwise, or it's going to be very difficult to be competitive. And two, if they really believe that in the short term, Miami can't support something in the range of $110 million, what do they expect is going to change between now and whenever they next succeed in restocking their farm system and adding this level of talent again, which there is no guarantee, by the way, that they will do? It just seems to raise the question of, is this the right ownership? Should this franchise even exist? Is this market too poisoned to ever support this team? Or is this market simply not capable of supporting this team?
And it's even more complicated than that, because what's being established here is a history of betrayals, right? Because the Marlins, they have won 2 championships. But what happens when a team that struggles in terms of attendance and has a history of not playing well, when they finally win, you tend to get the attendance bounce the next year. But in both times that the Marlins won the World Series, they almost immediately sold off their best players the next offseason. So that next year bounce in attendance never happened. So the momentum that a World Series appearance or win might give you was never allowed to happen. And not only that, it was compounded in the other direction by the idea that if we ever do have a good team, we're going to tear it down right away anyway. That happened twice. And so you've got the fan base, and admittedly, not everybody who might be a Marlins fan in Miami right now remembers 1997-98, but they probably heard about it. They know about it. And they maybe remember 2003, 2004. And even if they don't, that's kind of become the culture of baseball in Miami. And then to have the new ownership come in with again, what is roughly half of a playoff quality team and tear down anyway, then they're saying, oh, this is what happens here. And so in Miami, you've got an even higher bar to clear in order to bring the fans back or to bring them in the first place, because it's just this pattern of betrayal every, it's not steadily spaced out, but a pattern of betrayal over these many years that seems to be all that they're going to get from whoever owns the team, because we're talking about 3 different ownership groups now too that have done this. So that's the challenge. I think that if there was a single ownership group that had built on a championship, that had taken some leap of faith that the championship would have led to better attendance, which would have enabled the payroll necessary to sustain maybe not a repeat, but a team that won 83 or 84 games the next year and was at least competitive over a multi-season period. If there was a single ownership that ever did that, I think that maybe they would have built up a fan base that could sustain the team at least as a mid-level market for baseball. But this continual pattern of betrayal, I think, has gutted the potential for that kind of fan base. So whether or not baseball is viable in Miami, I think may have less to do with Miami than it does with 3 separate Marlins ownership groups who have basically done exactly the worst possible thing you can do to build a fan base. They've betrayed that fan base 3 times over. I think that's the trick.
I just think there's a double standard at work here. And maybe the fact that it was Derek Jeter blinded the commissioner to the realities of this situation. But imagine the Yankees were for sale, and I said to Rob Manfred, look, man, I've hocked my baseball card and comic book collection, and I've raised $1.5 billion, so I can afford to buy the team, but that's going to wipe me out. And so for the foreseeable future, after I spend my $1.5 billion buying the Yankees, we're going to be running $30 million a year payrolls. That's okay with you, right? And he would throw you out of his office because that would be disastrous for the game of baseball to have this permanently non-viable team in New York. Somehow, because it's Miami, he's willing to go along with it. And what would have made more sense, and I know that Loria, it's like Goodfellas, the scene with the sequence with the restaurant where they talk about, piling on debt and then you set fire to it to reap the insurance money. I mean, that's almost what Loria did over the years. I understand that they need to get out from under it. Baseball would have been better off subsidizing some of that debt and giving the new ownership a clean slate and bringing in somebody who, I'm not saying they had to get Bill Veeck, but somebody who was willing to say to the fan base, we are here for you. Those kinds of shenanigans are over. This is the team. These are the players you're going to see. Maybe he still says, look, we've got to trade Stanton because this contract it just was stupid the day it was signed, and it's going to be stupid the day that it ends, and it doesn't matter what he actually does. It's just not something that we can support because he's going to be fully 1/4 of any possible payroll that we might have. So I'm sorry, that's just something we're all going to have to suffer through. But otherwise, we're going to put a competitive team on the field, and they didn't do that.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't think you can isolate it as a just because it's Miami thing. I mean, the McCourt ownership in Los Angeles was similar to this in terms of the inability to really finance the team they bought. They were rescued from that situation, but it went on too long. There was complications there, of course, because of the divorce proceedings, which made the whole situation worse. And you've got the Wilpons in New York with the Mets for a number of seasons. Now, of course, they've owned the team for a very long time, but their financial situation has been a disaster for a while, and they haven't, from anything I've seen, received any pressure from baseball to sell. They have gotten some additional investments, additional minority owners, but this is not the only bad ownership in baseball. This is not the only team that isn't maximizing the potential of their market. Thankfully, like I said, the Dodgers situation was resolved. And of course, the new Dodgers ownership is the model for what you want, which is a team that comes in, or a team of owners that comes in flush with cash, ready to spend. Plus, I think they got a new TV deal on top of that. And you see the result is that Dodgers got back to the World Series for the first time since 1988. And they can afford to eat those bad contracts. That's never going to happen in Miami. You're never going to be able to just, swallow $20 million to Carl Crawford or whatever it is and go to the World Series. But at the same time, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, on some level, I think baseball might have been over a barrel a little bit with Loria saying, hey, I'm selling, I'm getting out. We got to get somebody in there. And like I said, the other prospective owners, and you have to realize that's a very tiny field, right? I mean, there's how many people or ownership groups are really interested in buying a major league team that's not the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Cubs. Like I say, it's kind of a poisoned well. So they're selling them a bill of goods on some level. They're saying, well, here's a team that's in a market that we've betrayed twice and have difficulty getting any sort of proper fan support. And it comes with this great player on a horrible contract. It's maybe not the most desirable purchase, but there were other groups involved that somebody had to buy it, but it's still a very unfortunate situation. And I do agree with the debt situation that maybe baseball could have done something to relieve that, because it's that inherited debt, I think, that's driving. I think it was something like $400 million in inherited debt that's driving all of these payroll slashing moves. But yeah, a $55 million payroll for a team coming in with new, I mean, is that what they can afford? I understand that's what their target is, and that's a rebuild. That's a rebuild. That's a strip it down to the bones and rebuild it type of payroll. It's not like these guys who are running this team, Michael Hill, he's one of these guys who's always been under the thumb of bad ownership. So I don't know to what degree we can really say whether he's a good or a bad general manager. But Derek Jeter has no experience in this. Bruce Sherman has no experience in this. And to do a rebuild right, you've really got to have the best people pulling the strings, making the moves. And I don't have a lot of confidence in this group right now that they're going to be able to do that.
Well, the question is, and you just nailed it, is that $55 million what they think the market can support going forward indefinitely? Or is it, like you said, a rebuild budget that's going to rise? Because the problem is, if it's the former, the way that baseball is structured, you have a 3 to 6 year window with each player, right? Because they come up and within 2 to 3 years, depending on service time, their salaries are going to start rising through arbitration. And then after that 6th year, they hit free agency. You're going to really have to have an almost Branch Rickey St. Louis Cardinals 1920s level farm system to sustain a team, because you're always going to have one team coming and one team going if you can't keep re-signing these guys. And that really is the difference right now between the good organizations and the bad organizations, is that, and this is one of the reasons why the free agent market has been so anticlimactic for a number of years, is that the good players never even get to free agency because teams can afford to retain them. All the Marlins are going to be are the 20s and 30s Phillies, who came up with all kinds of great players, but served as a farm team for the rest of the major leagues, because they, even in that period when the figures were in the hundreds and thousands of dollars instead of in the millions, they couldn't afford to spend to retain them.
Yeah, well, you look at a team like the Royals, who were able to do this rebuild. And of course, they were awful for many, many years, but when they finally started putting it together, making smart draft picks, and they built up a fantastic farm system, and they got a championship team out of it. But then they couldn't afford to retain the core of that team. Some of the players aged out. The rest of them basically all hit free agency this offseason, and they're facing going back into another rebuild. Their decision not to sell off the remaining pieces at the deadline this past year has basically put them on, instead of maybe a 5-year rebuild, it could be a decade or more before the Royals are relevant again, assuming they don't bring back any of those players. And even if they did, it's not enough to really sustain that team. And the Rays are another one that you kind of look at, where they finally got a smart front office and put things together and built a winning team, went to the World Series over a stretch of, I think it was 4 or 5 years. Only the Yankees won more games than them. But then once those players started to leave for free agency, or they had to start trading them due to accelerated salaries, they were never really able to piece it back together, because they just don't have the resources in terms of the ability to grow their payroll. And that's the other Florida team too. So I think that the Marlins, that's the sort of situation they're looking at, is they're hoping to strike gold and maybe put together one of those teams that can have a 3-4 year run that maybe they get back to another World Series and maybe they win another one, but then it's going to be another deep trough of losing for a half a decade or more before they're able to rebuild that kind of team again. And again, in both of those situations, particularly with the Rays, we're talking about extremely smart, progressive front office with the Cubs, with the Astros, with the Rays. The Royals got it done. I think they maybe had less respect around the league, but you certainly have to respect the results. We're seeing maybe some other teams possibly coming up now, whether it's the Brewers or even possibly the Phillies, other teams building that way, the Twins possibly. But the Marlins, it's not like, Jeter and Sherman came in and were like, we need to hire some of the best minds out there. We need to get, that one guy who's an assistant GM who everybody says is the next brilliant GM. We need to hire him. They didn't really do that. They fired a bunch of ex-players who were consultants, which is another one of those bad luck things they did. It was like, hey, let's fire Jeff Conine for no good reason, just right off the bat.
And whose salary was almost certainly a fraction of anything that would make a difference.
You know what? And this is something that's directly into your wheelhouse, I know, and I wrote this for you over at SB Nation 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, whenever it was that Jeter was, I think, dealing with his ankle issues. Derek Jeter, I'm fairly certain, models himself as an owner after George Steinbrenner.
Oh, great.
Because that was his guy. Not the 80s Steinbrenner, not the totally off his gourd kind of Trumpian Steinbrenner, but the 90s Steinbrenner who was willing to cede a little bit more ground to the baseball operations people, but still meddled too much and made these kind of ridiculous bad luck decisions. The scout fired in the hospital, the Jeff Conine thing, that reminds me of, and I know you'll know, whatever year it was, I think the Yankees got eliminated from the playoffs. George Steinbrenner got ticked off, decided he needed to cut some payroll, so he eliminated his dental plan because that's going to make a difference in the New York Yankees payroll. Let's get rid of the dental plan for all of the office workers. That'll solve it. Just like, why? What possible reason could you have to do that other than to just be cruel?
Right.
It's not going to help your bottom line that much. And I'm not saying that Derek Jeter is necessarily being cruel, but it's that idea of, do you think that's going to help? Are you trying to send a message? Is there some sort of football coach aspect of I'm going to be tough. Look at how tough I can be. Jeff Conine's not safe. None of you guys are safe type of thing. Is that?
And that doesn't fall on the general manager or the scouts, really, although scouts don't make a ton of money either. It falls on the secretaries. The secretaries are the ones who are going to get cavities and have to scrimp to pay the dentist bill. They're not the ones who traded Jim DeShays for Joe Negro.
It's ridiculous. But again, I don't even know if it's Jeter necessarily, but he's got to own all this stuff. He's kind of the face of the franchise now, particularly with Stanton gone, but the face of the front office, certainly. He always called George Steinbrenner the best owner in baseball. That's who he came up under. That's who he had all that tremendous early career success, not just personally, but the team. And I really genuinely think that somewhere in his mind, he thinks George knew how to win. Be like George. And that's the model. And I mean, certainly what he's done so far suggests that's true. Not that, Steinbrenner never would have stripped down his roster and aimed for the smallest payroll in baseball. That's certainly not it. But that's just the financial realities of this ownership group. But just these little middling things that don't, okay, you guys don't have any money or enough money to sustain a legitimate team and you've got to strip down the roster. That may be the reality of the situation and it's a bad situation, but that's just what it is. But all these little things on top of that just don't need to be there are very Steinbrennerian to me.
I want to reflect on one thing that you said earlier in terms of baseball not being assertive with these teams that are not really holding up their end of the bargain. And it made me think of Peter Gammon's famous line when the Pine Tar game happened in New York. He said that if Bowie Kuhn was still alive, this never would have happened. Bowie Kuhn, of course, was the commissioner at the time. And Bud Selig was the same thing. He was a corpse with a season ticket. They wheeled him out. He waved from the box on the field, and that was it. I know that he's considered this incredibly effective figure who presided over vast growth in the game, but sometimes correlation isn't causation. And whether it's the Dodgers or the Wilpons, there's just not a tradition of baseball taking an aggressive stance with those teams. And it's strange in a way, because it only is when teams are so bad that the other teams are materially affected by it that they take a stand. And I think there was a time I believe it was the early 40s when the Browns were so bad. This is, I'm pretty sure, again, this is not something I've looked up, and as I age, my memory is more and more faulty. But baseball essentially held an informal expansion draft for the Browns, where they got some sweetheart deals at the urging of the league, because teams were saying it's costing us more money to travel to St. Louis to play the Browns than we're getting back in our share of the road gate. And whereas that may be less of an issue now, it's still a thing. They still do share in the road gate. And I'm sure it affects the home gate too, because I don't know about you, but if I look at the local team schedule and, I have to pick between game A and game B, and game A has 3 future Hall of Famers coming in to play the local team, and game B has whoever the Padres threw out on the field that day, I'm not going to the Padres game. I'm going to go to the game with the big star lineup. I'm going to see the Dodgers or the Astros or whoever. You would think that baseball would care about these things. Even if they don't care about the Miami market specifically, they would care about the way it affects all the other teams that play that team.
Yeah, and now you've got 2 of these ownerships in the same division too. You've got the Wilpons and you've got the Sherman Jeter ownership in the National League East, which is going to be dominated by the Nationals. But then you've got Bryce Harper as a free agent coming up. And the Phillies have been terrible. Like I said, we just expressed a little bit of optimism about them, but that division was pretty awful last year. It's going to probably be similarly awful in the coming season, maybe with the Phillies and the Marlins switching roles. But it's not good for baseball.
And I just want to emphasize, since you mentioned them again, we're complaining about the Wilpons, and the Mets had a payroll, and again, they traded a lot of guys, so it fluctuated over the course of the season, but they were around 176 million, which it wasn't a smart 176 million or an effective 176 million. You have to discount it for the fact that they're in New York and say, well, maybe that was kind of inadequate for where they're playing and what they're trying to do. But that's how far the Marlins are from being serious when we are talking about saying that what the Mets did was possibly inadequate and the Marlins are going for 55 million.
Right, and then the Mets have other problems too. You can talk about that with Dave. About the front office and the training staff and the coaching staff and all the other kind of institutional issues they have there that just lead to disappointment after disappointment. Like I said at the beginning, they're kind of cursed, and you could say cursed not necessarily in a metaphysical way, but just cursed by bad decision making or whatever. But the Mets have their own problems, is my point. But yeah, it's and they did bring Cespedes back, which was impressive in its own way. Although it seemed like there was a lot of want by the player there to come back into that situation.
They should have traded him, by the way.
The Mets right now, I'm not making I'm kind of sitting back and waiting to see what they do, and so much with the Mets depends on the health of really all their players. Not just the pitching staff, where obviously if Syndergaard had been healthy for a full season or can be healthy for a full season, it changes things dramatically. I think that and Matz, I think we've all kind of given up on Harvey to some degree, but now you worry about Conforto, how much he's gonna be able to come back from the injury he had that ended his season, and Cespedes never seems to play a full season. So that's kind of, they have the talent. Obviously, they were just in the World Series a couple years ago. But injuries have just been killing them in one way or another, on top of bad look moves and just bad moves and whatever else. And it'll be interesting to see to what degree they're, the idea when Sandy Alderson came in is that it would change the culture. It didn't really seem to happen. And they're hoping now with Mickey Callahan, new manager, it's another attempt to change the culture. But we'll see. But again, I don't want to dive too deep on the Mets because I feel like you would do that a lot on this podcast. So there's a lot of other teams to talk about, but maybe we're good on the Marlins for now too, though.
It's never planned. Somebody said on Twitter that this was one of their favorite Mets podcasts, and we really don't talk about the Mets that much. I feel like it's just they tend to come up with David and Jesse because they're both close to the situation for different reasons, and that, as I think I've said at other times, folly is always fascinating. And my only other comment about that, about the Mets, is that when I was a kid, the $6 Million Man was on TV, and I had these awesome Bionic Man toys where you could snap off his arm and get a different arm and reattach it, and he'd be just fine. And that's my comment on Michael Conforto, or Matt Harvey, or Noah Syndergaard, or probably
or David Wright.
The entire team, probably. But I remember those toys fondly.
Steve Goldman here, not Steve Austin, but what's the difference? We're both broken. Either way, we'll be back after this brief commercial interruption.
Steve Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster.
So where does the Stanton acquisition put the Yankees? They won 91 games and they went to the playoffs and came within one win of the World Series. Their Pythagorean record would argue that they should have won 100, and their third order winning percentage over at Baseball Prospectus is, I believe, more like 103, that they somehow underachieved. That the Yankees are aware of this may be indicated by the fact that Joe Girardi is no longer the manager, and they find that differential between projected and actual won-loss records to be somehow attributable to the way he handled things as opposed to luck. I don't know. But do you see the Giancarlo Stanton acquisition and the subsequent dumping of Chase Headley, which opens up another set of questions that have yet to be resolved, as moving them closer to that 100 win mark and the championship that has eluded them since the long ago year of 2009?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously adding Giancarlo Stanton's going to make him a better team. It's not, though, he's not like a silver bullet type player. It's not like they had a giant hole in right field or even left field or even center field that all of a sudden they stick Giancarlo Stanton there and they get almost an entire, whatever he's worth, 6-7 wins, that much better right away. That's not really, although they did a decent sized hole at designated hitter, and apparently they're going to try to rotate Gardner and Judge and Stanton through the two corner outfields and DH, and we don't know what impact that might have on them. Could be good, could be bad. But the thing is that Stanton and Judge, Gardner's obviously known for his glove, but Stanton and Judge are very good defensive players as well. So there's not like an obvious choice. So let's just stick this guy at DH and then we're saved from his glove and we can get all these guys in there. Very possible that Hicks will regress from what was a good maybe 2/3 of a season last year. It's possible that Brett Gardner going to his age 34 season is going to take a step back. We don't know. I think Judge and Stanton on some level are kind of naturally going to step back a little bit from hitting a combined 111 home runs, which if they were teammates would have been the second most ever after Mantle and Maris in 61 hit 115. But even if they step back, they'll still be tremendously productive. But then Stanton, in the 5 years prior to last year, averaged 115 games played per season. So there's injury there. It's kind of like in the mid 2000s when the Yankees seemed to always have a 6-man, 6-star pitchers in the rotation. It's gonna work out on some level in terms of injury and performance. It's not going to be everybody at full speed or full strength all season long. Nonetheless, you add the defending National League most valuable player to the heart of your order, you're a better team. And you just gave the numbers on how good the Yankees were last year. They do have some more work to do, obviously, in addition to figuring out what they're going to do at second or third base, one of which you figure will eventually be, and by eventually, I mean possibly by late April or May, be in the hands of Gleyber Torres, who's coming off Tommy John surgery, but it's expected, he's one of the top prospects in all of baseball and is expected to spend most of the coming season in the major leagues. He may take one of those positions. We don't know how he's going to perform because he is yet to make his major league debut. They also have Miguel Andujar as a third base prospect. who got 8 at-bats in the majors last year, hit very well in the minors. I guess there are some concerns about his defense at third base. He may not be necessarily an immediate insert into the lineup. They may make another move. I suppose it's possible that they could try to bring Todd Frazier back, but that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, because it seems like the Headley move was a pure... And this is the interesting aspect of it too, right? Is that the Yankees now have the Stanton contract, and now the Yankees are starting to make some salary dump moves like the Chase Headley move. Now, Chase Headley is not the sort of player that you can't afford to lose, particularly with, like we say, the depth of prospects, of near-ready infield prospects that the Yankees have. Tyler Wade is another one who could suck up a bunch of at-bats at second base or maybe even third. Chase Headley, I think, made $13 million last year, and the trade was a pure salary dump. The Jabari Blash, the player they got back, is a 28-year-old former Rule 5 pick who's got a ton of power, but doesn't really hit for any kind of average. Is not put it together in the major leagues. I'm not even convinced he's going to be on the 40-man roster come spring training. It was really just a salary dump, and they sent Brian Mitchell there is essentially the sweetener to get the Marlins to take Headley back. It would have been kind of nice if they kind of redid the Yangarvis Solarte trade, which worked out well for the Padres. They just kind of switched those guys back and undid it. But, if they can find a taker for Jacoby Ellsbury, then they've cleared up a more significant amount of payroll. But in order to get rid of Ellsbury, who's completely out of a job at this point, really, he's the fifth outfielder on this team at best, and Clint Frazier really should be that guy. Jacoby Ellsbury, who's making, I think it's $22 million or something in the coming season, or that's the average on his salary, on his contract. To get rid of him, they're going to have to really sweeten a deal with a quality prospect that I don't know if they're necessarily going to want to get rid of. I mean, they may have to trade him with Clint Frazier, or somebody of that caliber in order to get rid of that contract. And I don't know if that's going to happen. So, but if they did that, then they'd have payroll room, which they could spend on a Todd Frazier. But then they also need help in the rotation. Right now, Luis Severino is an ace. And as long as he stays healthy, I'm confident that he's going into his age 24 season, that he will be the ace. Masahiro Tanaka didn't have a great season, but he chose not to opt out. He pitched well down the stretch and into the playoffs. There's still that elbow that could go twang at any second, but you feel confident about him as a number 2. They made a very smart, proactive move to acquire Sonny Gray at the deadline last year, so they have him in place. And Jordan Montgomery had a very good, underappreciated rookie season. That's 4, and that's not bad. But again, injuries pop up, and you need more depth than that. And Domingo Germán or whoever it is behind that is not the guys that they need if they're going to be a playoff possible pennant contending team. There's some talk about whether or not they might bring back Sabathia. There are other starters kind of on that level. Maybe an Alex Cobb, who's just had 1 year back from Tommy John surgery, and we don't really know what he's going to be going forward. Or a Lance Lynn, who's frankly just an innings eater at this point, or kind of has always been just an innings eater. Somebody on that level for kind of the mid to back rotation. They need rotation depth, and they probably need another infielder. And if they're trading $13 million of Chase Headley to create a hole that they may have to fill via free agency, there's more coming here. So it remains to be seen what the Yankees are. But in terms of the potential of their lineup, the quality of their bullpen, having Severino, Tanaka, and Gray at the top of the rotation, I mean, they're absolutely a contender. Maybe even you could say already a pennant contender. They're going to be a very good team going forward. A lot of those players are young. A lot of them are team controlled. There's a lot of optimism to have about the New York Yankees.
I think Jordan Montgomery did them a great service this year. Not in that he was great, and in fact, he wasn't as good as the season went on. He's certainly not a future number 1 or number 2, but that he was able to come in and pitch pretty much the whole season. At one point, they had talked about kind of prophylactically demoting him or sending him to the bullpen to keep his innings down. But when Jamie Garcia and some other pitchers either faltered or got hurt, he just kind of hung in there. And that he was able to be serviceable, I think, goes a long way to defeating that longstanding prejudice that the Yankees have had against younger pitchers. And it clears the way possibly to finally see a Chance Adams or a Justice Sheffield, maybe not immediately, maybe not winning a job out of spring training. And I'm sure they would rather sign somebody more veteran. And possibly by the time we get this episode live, that will have happened. But I wonder if as a result of that, they'll be more open to promoting those prospects. And of course, the difference between Montgomery and, for that matter, Chance Adams and Sheffield is that Sheffield does seem to have, again, maybe not an ace ceiling, that's a big ask, but a higher, part of the rotation possibility than those other guys. And when he's ready, it would behoove them to give him a shot.
Yeah, absolutely. The Yankees farm system is absurdly deep, to the degree that, they've made all these trades for Garcia, for Gray, for Frazier and Robertson and Conley, for Canley, and the Stanton deal, and they still haven't really gotten rid of any of their top prospects. Nobody they've given up is really somebody I felt they couldn't lose. I think I've spoken before on the podcast about how Blake Rutherford is not somebody who I really think is a future star in the major leagues. Sheffield, though, has never pitched above Double-A through 17, made 17 starts in Double-A last year. So I do not feel like he is close to being in the major league rotation. Chance Adams may be the guy who gets that opportunity. Of course, he has to seize that opportunity. He did get to AAA last year, so maybe. But I still feel like they've got to add at least one, I say veteran just meaning an established major league arm to the rotation, and probably somebody in the infield. But at the same time, you almost feel like this team is so good. The high end of this team is so good, and they have that depth in the minor leagues that they could be a legitimate contender without making another move. The other thing that'll be fun to watch with the Yankees in the coming season, I mentioned, because I just wrote this for Sports on Earth yesterday, on Tuesday, Stanton and Judge having combined for 111 home runs last year, and the record for two teammates being Mantle and Maris at 115. There's a lot of kind of home run history, particularly in the environment we have in the major leagues right now, that could be made by this Yankee team in the coming season. If you talk about those two guys averaging 50 home runs, not that they're necessarily going to, but they certainly could, because they averaged a lot more than that this past season. You talk about Gary Sanchez, if he doesn't hit the disabled list, possibly getting close to 40, because he hit 33 in a year that he did hit the DL this past year. You talk about Greg Bird, another guy, if he can stay healthy, which he hasn't in 2 straight years. But if he does, he certainly has 30 plus, 35 homer potential. Didi Gregorius has hit 20 or more the last couple of years. Brett Gardner will give you 15. You go down the line. The Yankees have the potential in their lineup. Obviously, they'd need health. But if they went out and got somebody like Todd Frazier, it might push them over the top to set the single season team record for home runs with these guys. Now, obviously, home runs aren't everything, but the players that hit the home runs for them are guys who also get on base and play good defense. It's a scary good lineup.
One nice little bonus to having an overcrowded outfield with 2 right fielders in Stanton and Judge, you alluded to this earlier, that they're going to rotate the outfielders through the DH spot. One way that teams punt on DH is that they might have a decent hitter at designated hitter, but every once in a while they'll say, well, we need to rest the shortstop today, so we'll give him a half day off. We'll sit the regular DH. We'll DH the shortstop, and we'll play Joe Utility infielder in the field. And the problem is that now you've put the shortstop, who presumably is less of a bat than the DH, in the DH spot, so you've lost something there, and Joe Utility infielder, who hits 220 with a 300 on base and a 320 slugging, in the shortstop spot. The Yankees will not lose a damn thing when they bench somebody to give Stanton or Judge a day off in the DH spot.
Yeah, partially because of that rotation, and also partially because their bench is likely, at least right now, to be made up of quality young prospects. Maybe not Torres. Torres may be a guy who's either going to start in the minors or start in the majors, but Tyler Wade, now he didn't hit much, but only in 63 plate appearances last year for them. Tyler Wade could be their utility guy. I mean, like I said, Frazier or Ellsbury is kind of your extra outfielder. Ellsbury is obviously not a prospect, but he's a former All-Star who actually had a decent season last year. Jacoby Ellsbury, I think of him as like a Nick Markakis type guy. Nick Markakis went to the Braves as a free agent, but if there's a team out there that believes in Jacoby Ellsbury the way that the Braves believed in Nick Markakis, and I'm not saying, it's not a wild thing. He's going to his age 34 season. He's owed a lot of money, but the Yankees maybe split the contract with that team. Maybe there's a team out there that does want him, even the Orioles possibly, because there was some talk about it's not going to happen, but there was a little bit of scuttlebutt the other day about a Manny Machado deal, which let's not even get into that because that's kind of craziness. But, Jacoby Ellsbury is a guy who maybe there's a team out there that would like to have him starting in their outfield. But at the same time, that shows you if he's that guy off the bench, That's a pretty good bench player to have. The Yankees, that depth, and the depth really, I think, is what made the Dodgers so good last year, is that they could rotate guys through positions, and whoever came off the bench was a good player. Depth makes for a lot. You think about the great Joe Torre era teams, and there was always a Strawberry or a Raines or a Fielder or whoever it was coming off the bench. They quality bench players, whether, back in the days when Posada and Girardi were splitting time behind the plate, Posada was kind of their backup catcher for a season or two in the early part of that run. I mean, they had a good quality bench, sometimes prospects, sometimes veterans, but I feel like this Yankee team, that depth is going to be what's there. They have the depth in the bullpen. They have the depth in the lineup. It's all about the rotation. I think it's just getting a couple extra arms in the rotation so that maybe a Domingo Germán or a Chance Adams is the depth player and not necessarily the automatic fifth starter.
And one other part of that depth, and I only mention him because I want the chance to comment on his name, is infielder Ronald Torreyes, who will always, to me, read as Ronald Torrey Ice.
I thought you were going to talk about Thairo Estrada, who's apparently was in Double-A last year as a shortstop, and Brian Cashman, I believe, mentioned as one of the guys who could get some time. I think that's kind of throwing a very wide net. But I think
his nickname has to be Gland, right?
Thairo Gland. Yeah, Torreyes, I think, is probably going to be the opening day starter at, I get, probably second base, most likely. Because, again, with Torres, whether or not he's ready full speed in spring training coming off the Tommy John surgery was in late June. He's not a pitcher, but again, playing an infield position, you're going to be making a lot of throws. The rate of recovery there, I'm not sure what it is. It's a little bit shorter for position players because they don't put as much strain on their arms. But whether or not he's ready full speed in spring training or for opening day, I still think that the Yankees may pull a kind of Chris Bryant sort of, playing time shenanigans sort of situation to get an extra year out of him prior to free agency, which would mean his debut wouldn't come until late April. So Torreyes, one way or another, I expect to be in the starting lineup on opening day, but then he bounces back to the bench and he's kind of a no-hit, good field infielder. But then the other thing we're going to get in spring training, there's a lot of pictures of Ronald Torreyes standing in between Stanton and Judge.
That's true. And just to add to the picture of Torreyes, he'll put together a decent batting average in singles, it seems like, but it's a very low-calorie, nutrition-free batting average because he doesn't really do much of anything else. I guess that's better than the utility player that I described a few minutes ago with the 300 on base and the 310 slugging percentage, but it's still not somebody that you'd want to see every day, and chances are you'd start rowing backwards really fast with 400 at-bats of that. To clarify something that we were kicking about earlier as we're talking here, and again, this is something that will be clearer long after this podcast has gone to its great reward, Susan Slusser, who covers the A's, tweets that they're edging up on liberating Stephen Piscotty from the Cards now that they have Marcell Ozuna. And that seems like a good kind of buy low acquisition for the A's. Again, the A's are not going anywhere and not planning on going anywhere, but this is an outfielder who in 2015 and 2016, when he was 24 and 25, played about 200 games and hit 282 and slugged 467. He was a disaster this year and got sent down, but even amidst that disaster, he had a 342 on base percentage because he maintained his selectivity. I think he's young enough that he could still rebound.
Yeah, I think he could rebound, and the A's, the A's are one. Being a national writer, on some level, I feel like sometimes there are teams you don't necessarily tune out, but are just kind of background noise for a little while. The Padres have been that for a while. There are a lot of, I know, Baseball Prospectus right now, and a number of other people are kind of bullish on their rebuild starting to take some traction. I'm not buying in. I don't see much to like in the Padres in the very near future, unless they're thinking that this is a 5-year out thing. But I just don't see it. And the A's are one of these teams ever since basically the Josh Donaldson trade. There was that period there where they got rid of Cespedes because his free agency was coming, but the Donaldson trade kind of did it for me. I haven't seen them make what to me is any meaningful forward movement since then. They've brought up some pitching prospects. They've struggled. They made some deals from some additional pitching prospects. They've struggled. They added a couple of relievers this offseason. Okay, whatever. Chris Davis has hit a lot of home runs for them with the low on base. okay, fine. It's just kind of treading water to me with the A's. If they add Stephen Piscotty, that doesn't move the needle for me. So I certainly think that, he has the potential to not be as bad as he was this past season, maybe even be a decent hitter moving forward. But I don't feel that moving the needle for the A's. Matt Olson's exciting, what he did coming up at the end of last year. Kind of a Hoskins kind of home run burst going into his age 24 season. That's kind of something, but I don't see a team here. It's just not coming together. So they want to add Piscotty and let the Cardinals get a little room there. That's fine. But what are they sending back? And the A's are just kind of white noise to me right now.
No, it's not unfair. And I mean, there's some stuff to be excited there. Matt Olson and Matt Chapman look like fun players going forward, and Chapman was almost instantly the best defensive third baseman in the American League and one of the best in the majors right from the moment he came up. But just to go by MLB depth charts, at this moment when this Piscotty trade has not happened, and for all we know won't happen, they list their outfielders, their major league outfielders, as Matt Joyce in right in a platoon with Mark Canha, Chris Davis at DH, I should mention him. He's a 40 homer guy, obviously, though he has his deficiencies. The journeyman version of Boog Powell in center, and the utility guy Chad Pinder in left. That's not serious. That's somebody's nightmare version of an expansion team. So
that's what I'm saying. And Piscotty doesn't change that outlook for me.
No, he doesn't.
So Matt Joyce had a decent year last year. He's kind of a good platoon player. Chris Davis hits a lot of home runs. They made the Healy trade, trading Ryan Healy to the Mariners to basically let Chris Davis play more DH because of his deficiencies. There's not a team there that I feel like adding a mid-level aging prospect is going to help.
So as we come to the end here, things that in the category of things that would push the needle, how do you feel about Shohei Otani signing with the Los Angeles Angels?
It's very interesting. I mean, no matter where he signed, it was going to be interesting. It's interesting because you now have two of the most thrilling players. Really, if you think about it, the best player from the Western Hemisphere in Mike Trout, and the best player from the Eastern Hemisphere in Shohei Otani on the same team, and very likely hitting back-to-back in the order at least 3 out of 5 days. That's extremely exciting. Makes the Angels a lot more watchable. And the other thing that shouldn't go overlooked is the fact that the Angels also have Justin Upton in that order. They added Upton very late last season and then gave him an extra year at the back end of his contract to prevent him from using his opt-out. So now he's in that order, and you've got Trout and Otani and Upton 3 out of 5 days. And even when Otani's not there, because that's something, I'll talk about that in a moment, you've got Trout and Upton hitting back-to-back, which is a huge upgrade over Trout and a 38-year-old Albert Pujols. What they've needed to do is to build a team around Trout. 3 years ago, they missed the playoffs by one game. Last year, they got back up close to 500, and they were kind of in that middling wild card mix for a while. And then you add Upton, you add Otani, and you say, well, maybe this could be an 85-win team or so, and that keeps them in that wild card mix. We still don't know what they're going to do at second base. Neil Walker is an option who's out there, although his defense makes him a borderline second baseman at this point in his career. But certainly the bat would be excellent and extends that. With Mike Trout and Justin Upton and Cole Calhoun, that's one of the better outfields in the major leagues, I think. And then with Otani, the trick with Otani in terms of the offense side of things is that, like I said, he's only going to be in that lineup 3 out of every 5 games at the most. There's a potential of the Angels going to a 6-man rotation, which maybe they get an extra start out of him there, but it stretches out the pattern a little bit. In Japan, they tend to use a 6-man rotation, or they kind of have a day of the week where Otani would be like the Sunday starter. They'd always have an off day on Monday. Otani would then DH the next 3 days and then take 2 days off to prepare for his next start. So there's a recovery day and there's a preparation day at the very least. 2 days in which you're not going to have him in the lineup at all. But at the same time, you do have him in the rotation, and he arrives as their ace. Otani definitely goes to the head of that rotation. The trick there, of course, is that he has not been stretched out very much in his Japanese career, partially because of that kind of Sunday starter situation. Also, this past year, he had an ankle injury and didn't make very many. He only made 5 starts all year. So you're looking at a guy who's maybe 160, 170 inning pitcher. But at the same time, if they decide that he's hit some sort of innings limit or they want to stretch him out a little bit, they can always make him a full-time DH after that. And that's something you can't do with a Steven Strasburg type situation where those guys just get shut down completely. If Otani, for any reason, and not an injury, obviously, which would keep him off the field entirely, but if they do decide that, we don't want to push him, there was a report about the condition of his ulnar collateral ligament, which the Angels said, this was information that every team had up front, and it's consistent with any pitcher of his age, so it's not really an issue. But at the same time, if there's any concern about the condition of his arm where they want to make a preventative measure, they can make him a full-time DH and still get a lot of value out of him. That's part of this two-way player thing and just how valuable he can be.
So, but two questions on that. A, do we know that? Do we know that he's going to be a superior major league hitter? And not because I've seen some people first guess that estimation. And then number two, what does this whole scenario do with Albert Pujols, who is signed through the end of time, is 38, and was arguably the worst player in baseball last year?
It gives them an excuse to get Pujols out of the lineup is one thing, which I think is another benefit, is almost an addition by subtraction sort of situation. Now, from what I've heard, the Angels are thinking, well, maybe Pujols can play first base on the days that Otani is the DH, which
he can't even run. He can't.
Well, yeah. That's a bad answer because it hurts them in the lineup and in the field. That they should just bench Pujols on those days, and maybe he can be a late inning pinch hitter for, Luis Valbuena or whoever. It does give them an excuse to say, hey, you know what, Albert, you're 38, you were terrible last year. We're not benching you for, Caleb Cowart or somebody like that. We're benching you for, the quote unquote Japanese Babe Ruth. Just take a couple extra days off per week and, come in and hit on the other days. I think that would be a benefit if they decide to do it that way. And at the same time, CJ Cron is not necessarily the kind of a winning major league first baseman, kind of an average bat, nothing special there. So I think that's a benefit to them to be able to have a reason to pull back on Pujols' playing time. In terms of Otani's potential as a hitter, no, he's not going to hit 330 with a 410 on base and slug close, 575. He's not going to do that. He's leveling up in terms of the level of competition, but his power is real. And he has, for the scouting reports are very enthusiastic about the quality of his swing and the quality of his at-bats. The Angels have had such a hole, like you say, Pujols was so bad for them last year before they got Upton. Left field had been a problem for them for a while. And so even if Otani hits more like, I don't know, 280 with a 360 on base and slugs about 480 or 500, which I don't think is out of the question, that's a big improvement for them. The Angels are a good fit for him in that way, in that it didn't take much to upgrade on what they had. So he doesn't have to be Aaron Judge. The trick is that they're only getting him 3 out of every 5 days. And when he's a starting pitcher, one of those 3 days, when he comes out of the game as a pitcher, he comes out of the game as a DH, and then they have to piece those remaining at-bats together from what they've got off the bench, which, again, if Pujols doesn't start at first base, then Pujols can be the guy who takes that next at-bat at DH, and it makes more sense. It's another reason to say, Albert, maybe not the first base thing. Sit on the bench. We'll get you in once Otani gets pulled, as a starter. But at the same time, it's just, there's a lot of value added on both sides of the ball. Yes, he's unproven. He's leveling up. But he's also the big thing for me is that he's going into his age 23 season. His talent is undisputed. A lot of times you'll see a player come over from Japan, whether it's a Japanese-born player or an American returning like a Miles Mikolas or a Tony Barnett. They're coming over in their late 20s or even in their 30s. And there's often this pattern with the pitchers where they'll have the first good year and then they'll regress a little bit after that. But there's also some natural regression in the aging curve for them at that point. Otani's on the other side of things. He's going into his age 23 season. He's still in that portion of the career where kind of the conventional wisdom is that he can continue to learn and make adjustments as any young prospect might. There's been some dispute about whether or not he should be treated as a prospect, but he's a 23-year-old who's never played in the major leagues. It sounds like a prospect to me. So he can make those adjustments like any other team player coming up. And so my optimism about his ability to adjust to the major league level and improve going forward at least based off whatever he does in 2018, improve in 2019 and beyond, is very high compared to another Japanese import or Nippon Professional Baseball import coming over at the age of 28 or 31 or whatever it is.
Cliff, thank you so much for dropping by. This was great fun, and I wish everyone could hang with us when we don't do this. You know, Cliff and I, for what, more than 15 years at this point, I think, have been getting together about once a month, and we will talk like this for 3, 4, 5, probably longer hours sometimes, and not just on baseball, but we'll range all over the map to politics and films and movies. And what I wanted everybody to know, at least on my side of things, what a tremendous exercise in self-discipline it is for me not to just pretend that we're at lunch and not start throwing out TV shows I've seen or movies we've talked about, or get into a digression as we did on Twitter last week about the plot of Billy Joel's Scenes from an Italian Restaurant and how the chronology of that song could possibly work. So all of you should be envious, because I have access to this and so much more on a regular basis. And it's so much fun for me to share with everybody just this one facet of things.
We actually stuck to baseball today. We didn't get into any, Chuck Berry digressions or anything like that. There's too much going on with these winter meetings and the Marlins and et cetera, and Otani and Stanton and everything like that. You didn't, I'm almost a little bit upset about that. We didn't get that in there, but that's all right. Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Steve, whether or not we're on the baseball stuff or talking about, the films of Alex Cox or the passing of the Smithereens Pat DiMaggio, rest in peace. There's a lot to talk about. And always fun with you.
I walked out on a Smithereens concert once at Rutgers, and I feel kind of bad about that now. It wasn't really my choice, but I went on kind of a date, and the said date about we had backstage passes too, and said date was not impressed, and we left somewhere halfway through the set, and that has somehow I somehow have blamed the Smithereens for that all these years. The date didn't go particularly well either. There was no encore to that. So maybe it was me. Maybe it wasn't them. I don't really know. But I had this awkward experience, so I've kind of stayed away from them all this time.
Well, now's a good occasion to get back in. The first 2 or 3 albums are outstanding. You can get the greatest hits, blow up Blown to Smithereens, which has got all the essential tracks. I mean, Steve, honestly, is right in your wheelhouse. It's a kind of 80s Children of Nuggets, 60s pop rock, power pop derived stuff. Outstanding. At their best, outstanding. One of the great New Jersey bands. Pat DiMaggio passed away yesterday at the age of 62 after a fall, apparently. A real shame, but his music is outstanding, and I as much as you may mourn the passing of some of these people, I always use it as an occasion to get back into their work. Whenever somebody like that, whether I was a big fan, and as I was in this case, or maybe had never actually ventured into the work they've done, whenever somebody notable in the arts passes like that, I always say, this is my occasion. I'm going to go back and listen to those records, watch those films, whatever it is that they did, and appreciate their art, because that's still here.
They did kind of a song-for-song cover of Revolver or Rubber Soul or something a while back also, isn't that right?
They did after their proper peak. And they were really an 80s, like I said, an 80s power pop band with the 60s roots. After that, they released an album apparently the day before Nevermind came out, which didn't work real well for the type of music they were doing. That went poorly. And so they released one more record after that I think actually contained a song called Sick of Seattle. It just wasn't, they were just kind of hitting the rocks at that point. And yeah, they kind of went away for a little while. And when they came back, they did a few covers. They did 2 Beatles covers records, and one where they did, I don't know how much of, but The Who's Tommy. The entire album is songs from The Who's Tommy. I have not ventured into those. I'm not, the kind of hardcore. I don't have like Pat DiMaggio solo albums. But, like I said, those first 3 albums, from the 80s or greatest hits collection is very much worth the time of anybody who likes that kind of music. And apparently they also did an album in 2011. Their biggest success in terms of album sales was an album called 11, which featured A Girl Like You, which is the one song that most people probably know by them. Apparently, see, now you've got me off on this, and here we go. A Girl Like You was intended to be like the key song in Cameron Crowe's Say Anything. And if you think about the chorus, it's I'll say anything just to win the love of a girl like you. So he's got the title of the song, the movie in the song, but he was a little too on the nose, apparently, with the lyrics. Crowe felt that even though he doesn't like outline the plot specifically, that DiMaggio gave away too much of the plot in the lyrics, so so it didn't make the soundtrack. But it was a minor hit for them, which is about all they did in terms of scoring hits. That was called 11, and in 2011, apparently they went back to DiMaggio, wrote a new set of original songs for an album called 2011. And from what I hear, that's almost as good as the original stuff. So I'm going to go out and get myself a copy of that. Perhaps I'll report back to you next time.
All right, ditto. I will catch up with their work, and we will leave it there for now. And I will belay my temptation, since you name dropped Chuck Berry, to talk about my many faceted experience with the song Memphis, which it just is so catchy and yet tragic, as it turns out, as it's not his typical I want to get with a girl song, but about his estranged 6-year-old daughter. So we will leave that hanging there. Everybody do their homework on the Smithereens and various Chuck Berry covers, and we'll catch up next time that Cliff drops by. Have a wonderful, happy holidays, Cliff.
You too, Steve.
By Captain America's mighty shield, we have come to the end of another episode. You can follow Cliff on Twitter at Cliff Corcoran. It's as easy as riding a bicycle if you've ridden a bicycle before. And you can follow me at Go Stephen Goldman. Why Go Stephen Goldman? Because Grok Stephen Goldman led to a cease and desist letter from the Robert Heinlein estate. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by Number 35. Our producer is Number 35. In fact, when George Steinbrenner acquired him for me, he said, "Congratulations, Lou, I've won you the pennant." And I said, "That's wonderful, but my name isn't Lou." Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been hearing throughout the episode, was co-written by myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who just a couple of weeks back gave me a fascinating lecture on Malbec varietals. In addition to being the best composer I've ever worked with, he's an oenophile. Well, if having edited this episode doesn't lead to my immediate institutionalization, I'll be back next week with more tales and discussion from inside the Infinite Inning.